A 10-cent part killed at least 124 people, and the company that made it knew for almost 10 years before it changed a thing. In 2005, an engineer at General Motors flagged something wrong with a small mechanical part, an ignition switch. Under specific conditions, if a driver's knee brushed it, or if the keyring got a little heavy, the switch could slip out of the run position and drop into off, or into accessory, while the car was still moving. Picture that for a second. You're driving on a highway. Nothing dramatic happens first. No warning light, no loud noise. The key just shifts a few millimeters in the wrong direction. And in that instant, 3 systems vanish at once: power steering, power brakes, and the electrical circuit that arms the airbags. The wheel gets heavy. The pedal gets stiff. And if you crash in the next few seconds, the airbags that were supposed to save you do nothing, because the system that triggers them isn't powered anymore. That's the mechanism. And it isn't exotic. It isn't a buried software bug in a million lines of code. It's a spring inside a switch that was, by GM's own internal specification, weaker than the engineering standard required. It was cheap to build, and it was already tooling approved, a phrase worth sitting with, because it turns out to be the real hinge of this entire story. What makes this defect uniquely dangerous is that it's intermittent. It doesn't fail every time. It fails occasionally, unpredictably, depending on how heavy your keychain happens to be that day, or how your knee brushes past it during a routine turn. An intermittent failure is far scarier from a diagnostic standpoint than a consistent one, because a part that fails every single time gets noticed fast and gets fixed fast. A part that fails once in 1,000 trips looks, from the outside, like driver error, like a fluke, like bad luck. It's the mechanical equivalent of a landmine buried under an ordinary-looking lawn. You can walk across that lawn 100 times safely. The 101st time, you step in exactly the wrong spot, and it's already too late to do anything about it. Here's the part that turns a hardware failure into a management case study. GM did not treat this as a safety defect. Internally, it got a quiet label, and I'm using their own language here, a customer convenience issue. Think about what that label does before you even get to the physics of the switch. A safety issue triggers a recall process, a legal review, a paper trail that runs up to executives and regulators. A convenience issue drops into a slower queue, prioritized against comfort features, minor rattles, cosmetic complaints. 2 completely different bureaucratic pipelines, and the switch got filed into the wrong one. Not because engineers were confused about the physics, several of them weren't confused at all, but because of what that classification would trigger downstream. And this is where it gets genuinely strange. When engineers pushed to fix the switch, they were told the part had already cleared tooling approval, meaning changing the design meant admitting, on paper, in a permanent document trail, that GM had approved a defective part in the first place. That admission has a cost, not just the engineering cost of retooling a line, but a reputational and legal cost, a paper trail that reads, "We knew, and we approved it anyway." So instead of formally changing the part and creating that trail, GM did something quieter. They swapped in an improved switch, one with a stronger spring, but kept the exact same part number on it. Read that twice. The old, weak switch and the new, stronger switch carried identical part numbers in GM's own records. To anyone auditing the system later, including investigators trying to figure out why identical-looking cars were behaving differently, the part looked unchanged. It wasn't, but the paperwork said it was. That single decision, keeping the part number the same, might be the most important moment in the whole timeline, arguably more consequential than the original weak spring. A single engineering flaw is an accident. Concealing that flaw's own fix, hiding the fact that a fix ever happened, is a choice. It's the difference between a mistake and a cover-up, even if nobody in that room thought of it that way at the time. My guess is most of the people involved in that part number decision didn't picture themselves as covering anything up. They probably thought of it as avoiding paperwork, or avoiding an awkward supplier conversation, or just taking the path of least resistance. That's what makes this so useful as a lesson. Most concealment doesn't feel like concealment while it's happening. It feels like convenience. There's also a sunk cost logic tangled up in the tooling-approved excuse that's worth naming directly. because it shows up everywhere, not just in car factories. Once money has already been spent setting up a manufacturing process around a specific part, admitting that part is wrong feels like admitting the earlier spending was wasted. So the instinct isn't to ask, what's the safest thing to do now? It's to ask, how do we avoid writing off what we already spent? That instinct feels rational in the room. It rarely survives contact with a courtroom or a congressional hearing, or, in this case, 124 families who never got an explanation until years later. For years, this stayed invisible. Cars kept crashing. Drivers kept dying, sometimes with reports showing no alcohol, no drugs, no obvious explanation for a crash that should have been survivable, given that the vehicle supposedly had functioning brakes, power steering, and airbags. Investigators looked at individual crashes as individual crashes. Nobody was connecting a sedan crash in one state to a similar crash in another state 3 years later because the common thread, a shared switch design and a shared quiet fix that never generated a new part number, was invisible in the exact records everyone was trained to trust. By 2014, the death toll tied to this single defect had reached at least 124 people. GM recalled 2.6 million vehicles. Sit with that number for a second. 2.6 million cars sitting in driveways and parking lots and on highways, each one carrying a mechanical flaw that had been known internally, in some documented form, for close to a decade. Congressional hearings followed, the kind where executives sit under camera lights and answer questions they clearly rehearsed and still stumble on. Then came the settlement, $900 million. Not a rounding error, not a line item anyone shrugs off. Money that, in hindsight, would have been dwarfed many times over by the cost of just fixing a 10-cent spring back in 2005. Now here's the part I think most people get wrong when they retell this story, and it's worth pausing on directly, because it's the part that actually matters if you manage people. It's tempting to look for the villain, somebody at a desk who said, "Let it slide, we'll save money." Internal investigators who dug through this later found something less satisfying, and, honestly, more unsettling. There wasn't one villain. There was a habit, a company-wide pattern of avoiding bad news, where raising an alarm felt more career risky than staying quiet. Nobody wanted to be the person who stood up in a meeting and said, out loud, in front of people who could act on it, "We shipped something dangerous." Not because they didn't care about safety in the abstract, but because saying it plainly, attaching your name to that sentence, felt like it would cost you something immediate and personal, while staying quiet cost the company something distant and abstract. That trade tempts individuals towards silence every time, even when the aggregate outcome is catastrophic. I want to slow down on that, because it's the actual mechanism worth remembering, more than the switch itself. Every organization has some version of this trade baked into its incentives, whether anyone designed it on purpose or not. If speaking up about a problem is personally costly right now, and staying quiet is only costly to some abstract future version of the company, most people, given ordinary incentives and no unusual courage, will choose quiet. That's not a moral failing unique to GM's engineers. It's just what happens when an organization's structure rewards silence faster than it rewards honesty. So here's the part nobody expects when they first hear this story, because most people assume the lesson is about cars, or safety engineering, or corporate ethics in some abstract sense. It isn't, not primarily. The lesson that actually transfers to anyone running a team or a project or a department that has nothing to do with automobiles is about labels. Specifically, it's about who gets to assign a label to a problem and what that label automatically triggers once it's stuck. Call something a convenience issue, and it inherits every process built for convenience issues. Low priority, slow review, minimal escalation. Call the exact same underlying fact a safety issue, and it inherits urgency and visibility instead. The switch itself didn't change. The spring's tension didn't change. Only the label changed, and the label alone determined the entire trajectory of what happened next for almost 10 years, across millions of vehicles. That should unsettle you a little, because it means the single most consequential decision in this entire story wasn't a technical one. It wasn't even, strictly speaking, one villain making an evil choice in isolation. It was a categorization decision, made early, probably without much drama in the room, that then propagated downstream through years of institutional inertia. Nobody has to be a villain for this to happen. You just need a system where the label something gets assigned early determines how seriously anyone treats it later, and where changing that label carries a personal cost to whoever proposes the change. There's a broader idea underneath all of this that management researchers sometimes call psychological safety, the sense that you can raise a concern in a room without it costing you personally. GM's culture, at least around this specific defect, seems to have had very little of it. Not because anyone announced a policy against raising concerns, nobody ever writes that policy down, but because the informal cost of speaking up plainly outweighed the informal cost of staying quiet, meeting after meeting, for years. That gap between the formal rules on paper and the actual incentives people feel in the room is where problems like this one live and grow undisturbed. Think about how this shows up in far smaller, far less dramatic settings than a car company. A manager labels a customer complaint an edge case instead of a pattern, and it gets deprioritized for a quarter while more complaints quietly pile up behind it. A team labels a security finding low severity because fixing it properly would mean admitting an earlier architectural choice was wrong, and that finding sits open for months, then years. A leader labels a resignation an isolated personal decision instead of a symptom of a team-wide morale problem, and nobody investigates the pattern until 3 more people walk out the door. None of these are ignition switches. Nobody dies. But the mechanism, the exact mechanism, is identical. The label absorbs the urgency, and once absorbed, the underlying problem becomes invisible to anyone who isn't already looking directly at it. Here's a question worth asking yourself the next time you're the one doing the labeling, or the next time someone hands you an already categorized problem and expects you to just accept the category as given. Who benefits from this label being what it currently is? Not who's lying, not who's evil, just, structurally, whose life gets easier if this stays classified the way it is right now? If the honest answer is whoever would have to pay for the expensive fix if it were classified differently, that isn't proof of wrongdoing on its own, but it's a signal. It's exactly the kind of signal that, in GM's case, sat in plain sight for a decade, described in internal documents using precisely the soft language that made it easy to keep ignoring. Now picture this same failure pattern playing out somewhere with far lower stakes than a moving vehicle. A software team labels a crash report unreproducible after 2 failed attempts to trigger it, and quietly closes the ticket, even though a small fraction of users keep hitting it every single week. A hospital administrator labels a scheduling gap a staffing preference rather than a structural understaffing problem, because fixing it structurally would mean admitting a budget decision from 2 years earlier was wrong. In every one of these cases, the actual underlying fact barely matters compared to which bucket it gets sorted into on day 1. That's the transferable insight sitting underneath a story about cars. Organizations don't usually get hurt by the problems they see clearly and choose to ignore. They get hurt by the problems that get correctly identified once, quietly, by someone paying close attention and then get mislabeled into irrelevance before anyone with real authority ever looks at them directly. And there's one more layer worth adding here, because it's easy to miss on a first pass through this story. The part number decision shows that even after a fix exists, the way you document that fix can recreate the exact same blindness all over again. GM's engineers did eventually build a better switch. The narrow technical problem actually got solved reasonably fast. What kept killing people for years afterward wasn't a lack of engineering capability. It was a paperwork decision made to dodge an uncomfortable admission that made the fix invisible to the very systems designed to catch exactly this kind of pattern across a large vehicle fleet. A fix nobody can see is barely better than no fix at all, especially when investigators are relying on records to tell them which cars share which components. It's also worth noticing what didn't happen here, because absence is often more telling than presence. Nobody outside the company forced this reclassification to happen faster. No internal whistleblower process caught it early. No routine audit flagged the part number mismatch before it had already killed dozens of people. The system that was supposed to catch exactly this kind of drift, engineering review, safety escalation, documentation integrity, all of it existed on paper at GM. It just didn't activate, because activating it required somebody, at some specific meeting, to treat a convenience-labeled ticket as more urgent than its label suggested. Processes don't enforce themselves. People enforce processes, and people respond to the incentive sitting directly in front of them, not to the abstract policy manual sitting in a drawer. So, if you manage people or projects or anything with moving parts and imperfect information flowing up to you, the actionable version of this story isn't check your ignition switches. It's this: before you accept a categorization someone hands you, whether it's low priority, minor, cosmetic, edge case, or convenience issue, ask 2 questions out loud in the room where people can hear you ask them. First, who benefits if this particular label sticks? Second, and this is the one people almost always skip, is the act of categorizing this thing actually the risk you should be watching, more than the underlying technical fact itself? Because in GM's case, the spring was never really the story. The label was the story, from the very first meeting where somebody chose one word over another, and everything else, the silence, the part number, the decade, the 124 lives, and the $900 million, followed from that one quiet, almost boring administrative choice. I want to know how you think you'd have handled being the engineer in that first 2005 meeting, the one who spotted the flaw and got told the fix cost too much. Drop a comment with what you honestly think you'd do in that room, not what you'd like to believe you'd do, because those are 2 very different answers, and the honest one is usually the far more interesting one.